Okay, so thank you everyone. I am Manuel Hernandez. I work at IFPRI in Washington, DC. And this is a joint paper with Susie Godlonton from Williams College and my colleague Cynthia Paz from IFPRI. Basically, in this paper, what we're trying to do is we basically analyze whether survey design can help us reduce anchoring bias when collecting retrospective data. And we work from data from Malawi. The motivation is pretty clear in terms of this paper. Recall biases in retrospective data collection has been well documented and have important implications for empirical analysis. One of the common recall biases observed in agricultural settings is anchoring bias. No? And by anchoring bias, we mean that the respondents tend to use their most recent outcome as an anchor when recalling their past outcomes, no, for previous periods. No, that's something that is very commonly observed in agricultural settings. So we basically leverage on the survey design literature to evaluate different strategies that can help us attenuate this mental anchoring when collecting retrospective data. No? Basically, we examine three different strategies: reversing the order of questions, using memory retrieval cues, which is basically introducing structural prompts that can help the respondent aid their past outcomes. And we also introduce an aggregate community anchoring, no? That we are trying to disrupt the individual mental anchoring, basically by directly letting them know that this was, for example, the past outcome of the group they belong to, no? That can help us as a more proximate recall element. No? And we focus on two types of indicators. No? One objective, which is basically volume of production. Most of our working sample, I mean, their main crop is maize. So we explore responses on volume of maize production. And the other one is a subjective indicator, which is the level of happiness, which is basically measured on scales 0 to 10. No? And we basically assess the extent of bias reduction across these different survey model designs. So our research design is embedded in a 3-year longitudinal survey that was collected for other purposes, for an RCT agricultural intervention, which was basically, this RCT is designed to basically provide capital transfers and extension services to smallholders. So basically we had 3 years. In 2014, we collected the baseline characteristics. In 2015, we collected what we call concurrent outcomes, which is basically like the volume of production or the level of happiness in 2015. And in 2016, we asked for the same questions, but also we asked respondents to recall the values from the previous year. No? And that's where we embed our survey design experiment. No? And we explore these different options or strategies, no? Reversing the order of questions, using memory retrieval cues or structural prompts, or framing at the community level instead of the individual level. Just to mention that and the design is well balanced across the 6 treatment groups that we use or model designs in terms of individual and interview characteristics. So the data is comprised of smallholder farmers that they are located in 2 districts in Malawi, in central Malawi, Dowa and Kisi districts. We have a total of 967 households, out of which 941 are maize producers, and 964 reported their happiness level. No? The average age is 41, basically 42 years old, and 2/3 of them are women in our sample. So the first thing that we need to do before exploring these differences in anchoring across these different survey designs is first we have to document the anchoring. No? And to document the anchoring, we basically run a regression where we model the recall value, the 2015 recall value, on what they responded on 2015 at that point in time, and also what they responded on 2016, which is basically the anchor variable. No? And that's where we see, and that's why it's highlighted, where we see this correlation between what happened in 2016, the most recent period, is partially correlated, statistically significant with the recall for the previous year. No? And this is after accounting for what they said in 2015. No? the 2015 concurrent values, what they said the previous year. No, and we are of course controlling for all set of individual characteristics, interview characteristics, which are also important to take into account. And of course, we also account for heteroscedasticity in the regressions. So once we document the anchoring, then we are interested in exploring, okay, these different model designs, how can they help to attenuate this anchoring, no? And basically what we model is the dependent variable is a recall outcome, is a function of what they reported the previous period, which is the reference value, what they report in the most recent period, which is the anchoring value, and we're also interested in this dummy or binary indicator that basically identifies the different survey designs that we use, and the interaction of that dummy variable with the anchoring value, which is basically what happened in the most recent period. No? So our parameter of interest is delta K, which is going to capture the differences in the degree of anchoring across these different treatment modules, no? that we explore. And this is our main results. This is probably the most important slide of the presentation. So here, what we're showing here is we're basically comparing the estimated deviations in the recall value versus what they said in the previous year. And we are comparing this across the different treatment modules relative to our baseline treatment group, which is basically asking first about the present and then about the past. No? So here, for example, treatment 2 is when we reverse the order of questions. No? So instead of asking first about what happened today and then what happened the previous year, we basically ask first about what happened the previous year and then today. It's just basically reversing the order of questions. And we get a bias reduction in the order of 34%, no? Without any increase in the time of data collection. No? When we use structural prompts, so that means we ask about the present value and then about the past. But before asking about the past, we introduce these retrieval memory cues, which is basically some qualitative questions about, okay, so this is what you produced this year. You would say, before asking about the production the previous year, we actually ask them, was this volume of production higher, lower, or the same as the previous year? It's like we're providing a little bit more time for the respondent to better recall the previous outcome. No? When we do that, we get basically roughly a 15% bias reduction, but it's less precise, no? As you can see from the standard errors. And when we introduce community anchors, instead to trying to disrupt or break this individual anchoring behavior, so basically we let them know last year in your group, in your farmers association group, the average production of maize was this amount. No? That's what we provide before asking about the previous outcome. In those cases, actually, we exacerbate the bias, no? On average. No? So basically, we're actually increasing the bias, again, compared to our baseline treatment group, which is asking first about the present and then about the past. This is just to provide additional information about the results that we obtain. Here, we just want to show that what happened today is very important. This is the anchor variable, which influences a lot what you say in the past. No? And here, what we're plotting here is basically on the horizontal axis is the 2016, which is the most recent outcome for different percentiles, the 10, 25, 50, 75, and 90 percentiles. And basically, we are reporting the effect of the different treatment models that we're using against the baseline treatment. No? And what we see is that we said that on average, reversing the ordering of questions helps, but it helps more for farmers that produce relatively less or small to moderate amounts. No, for farmers that in the most recent year produce a lot, reversing the order of questions actually doesn't help. No? And the same happens if we use structural prompts. No, so again, I mean this is helpful on average, but it's more helpful for relatively smaller volumes of production in the most recent period. No? And we see the opposite when we use this community anchor, this group anchoring. In here, actually, what you see is that actually that's why we exacerbate the bias, no? Particularly for lower volumes of productions. And actually it's not helpful on average, because it can increase the bias. So just to conclude, retrospective data collection, even for relatively short reference periods, in this case just 1 year, is heavily influenced by the most recent situation. We explore whether survey design can help to reduce this bias. We focus on maize productions and also for happiness. And we just presented the results for maize for 2 reasons: in the sake of time, and also because for happiness, we didn't find any statistical significant results. And for the case of maize, we find that reversing the order of questions can help to reduce the bias up to 34% on average, without any increase in the data collection time. When we use memory retrieval cues, are less successful and precise in reducing the bias. And when we introduce an aggregate community anchor, actually the bias can be exacerbated. For happiness report, neither reversing the order of questions or retrieval cues can help to alleviate the bias. And we also explore heterogeneous effects by sex, age, education, household size, land size, and location, and we don't find any significant differences. And as part of future work, we also want to assess whether survey design can help reduce the bias in other outcome indicators of interest. Here we focus on maize volume of production, but there are of course other indicators of interest such as income or working hours that require also more mental efforts, and probably the bias is stronger for those indicators. Remember also that maize it's a main crop produced by farmers. We didn't ask about other crops, which probably would also require more mental efforts. And we're also interested in exploring options when we're interested in collecting information for more than one previous period. No, if we think about multiple past periods, we also would like to explore whether survey design can help on this regard. And that's all I have to say. Thank you. That's the time. Yeah,
we got a couple minutes for questions if you guys have any questions.
Yes.
I don't know if you find it's really interesting, and I'm sorry that I missed the beginning of your presentation.
Yes.
But every time we go to do household surveys, we always rely on the farmer to remember what they have done, especially when we're asking management questions, not only the output, which is sometimes the most important for them because they sell it and that's
yes.
But have you guys done some experiments on the management part, because knowing how much fertilizer, pesticides, or so on does change or not depending when you ask that particular question? And the other is the happiness part. To me, it seems like a variable that changes too much, depending on your condition, how you wake up that day, if you were sick or not.
Yes.
So I don't know how you guys are using it, and that's why I say sorry that I need maybe you explain it a little bit more. But why were you interested in happiness?
Yes, thank you for the 2 questions. Yeah, the first one definitely. Yeah, we want to explore other indicators that also require more mental efforts. I mean, I mentioned income or working hours, but also management practices. They likely have measurement error, and that's something that has important implications for empirical analysis. And ideally, we would like to explore that in the future. No, so. This paper is basically an extension of a first paper that we did before, where we documented actually anchoring behavior with farmers in Central America, basically in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. And then we decided to explore in this survey, but we moved to Africa. And we first documented they are behaving the same. Anchoring is present typically, I mean, in most settings, but we explored this with maize volume of production and happiness, no? But of course, ideally, we would like to explore with these other indicators. In the paper in Central America, we document anchoring on other indicators like working hours, income, but we didn't get to management practices. But that definitely will be an interesting future avenue of research, no? In particular, input use, for example, no? Which is something very important, and now it's also an important topic due to the current crisis. On the second question, yeah, basically we decided to work with an objective and a subjective indicator, but this is just it's a self-reported subjective indicator, and I fully agree with you that the level of happiness, we were expecting more anchoring on the subjective indicator compared to the objective one, and actually we were finding on both of them, and that also happened in Central America in the other paper. But the thing that we get is that all of these different alternative treatment designs that we explore, in none of them we find that the bias is reduced for the subjective one. So that's also something of for future work, no? How can we attenuate that bias in the future, no? Because definitely when we say what happened today to you influences what you're gonna recall or remember about the past, yeah, for subjective we expect a much more anchoring behavior. It's similar, but unfortunately, I mean, reversing order of questions or using memory retrieval cues doesn't help. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. That was a very good presentation. So one question is just about the implication. So what we think about the implication of this kind of because I agree with you that even when we look at management practices, when we go to input use, I think there are a lot of studies that have shown that farmers are always misreporting their farm size, misreporting the use of improved seeds and the likes. This high level of misclassification. So and for this kind of inputs, they always say that it's very important that you kind of do this genetic mapping to show that farmers are cultivating what they say they are cultivating. But from the results, what do you think of the implications of this? Are you telling us to not just rely on your questions?
Well, there is always an ideal world, no? The ideal world would be to basically try to collect, I mean, as frequent information as possible and try to compare it with administrative data or even more precise data. Plot size, for example, is something that has also been heavily studied also and has also important implication for productivity and other type of analysis. But yeah, I mean, that will be the recommendation, but of course, resources are scarce. Yeah. So if you're in situations where you have to rely on recall information, yeah, I mean, in this case in particular, for example, just reversing the order of questions can help, no? I mean, of course, doesn't solve the problem, but can alleviate up to a certain point, at least for the objective outcome volume of production. Of course, ideally, we would like to explore these for other indicators of interest, no? That require, again, more mental efforts, no? Which we don't know what's going to happen there, because we suspect that the more mental efforts requires, the more anchoring behavior you're going to expect also, no? But that's a prior that we would like to also to explore in the future, no? And the same for the subjective ones. But yeah, that would be kind of partial recommendation in a non-ideal world.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
So I'm not seeing the blow up option.
Go to view or presentation mode at the top right. Yeah. This is Windows, right? I think F5 works.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, so hi, so welcome to this session. It's my pleasure to present this work. So this was the last paper of my PhD dissertation when I was completing from the University of Bonn, and this is co-authored with my professor Thomas and postdoc Sebastian. So basically, there's this large literature that keeps talking about poverty traps in Africa, and it stresses a lot on Africa because unlike in other regions of the world where you could see poverty reducing, it's kind of increasing in Africa. And if we think of the existence of poverty traps, most of the studies always attribute these poverty traps to external constraints, so lack of credit markets, malnutrition. And nowadays, we could also think of COVID, which is rolling back many years of developmental efforts in the fight against poverty. But beyond these external constraints, one could also think of internal constraints. This involves socio-emotional skills, but also cognitive limitations, things to do with aspirations, locus of control, self-efficacy, that kind of hinder poverty as well. And it's very likable, as Travis Libet highlighted that these external constraints could also be working directly on these internal constraints. So you could be very poor and it kind of affects you. And if one is thinking about it that way, it's highly unlikely that one exits poverty without aspiring to leave poverty. So far, one constraint which I'll be looking at is aspirations. And aspirations have been shown to be very important for both human capital, but also political behavior. So practically, they've been shown to increase human capital investments, things to do with financial investments, savings. It has also been shown to empower women, increase political aspects like civic engagement, making people to believe and participate in political activities. From a more smaller point of view, it has been shown to induce happiness, but it has also been shown to improve food security. And if one is thinking of all these nice implications of aspirations, then the normal policy implications that comes to mind is that if aspirations are this important, then we should just boost aspirations. But this is not straightforward, and that is what I'm going to show in this presentation. So because there is an established theoretical link that shows that if aspirations are too high, then they rather make households to disinvest. So you should improve aspirations up to a particular point, and beyond that threshold point, you should not increase aspirations, because then it's gonna lead to disinvestments and negative behaviors. So basically, in this study, what we did is we looked at we basically examined this the relationship between the income aspiration gap and livestock investments in Kenya. So we kind of tested this theoretical relationship, and we define aspiration gap as the difference between your current level and what you aspire for. So it is not aspirations that make you to invest, but it's that gap. So you could have a gap of like or you could have a current status of like maybe $1,000 today, and your aspirations is like $5,000. So what makes you to aspire? It's not your current status, it's not even your aspiration, but it is that gap. So how large that gap is determines the kind of investment you're going to take. So just a brief preview of the results. We find evidence of this inverse U-shaped relationship between aspirations and livestock investments in Kenya. Therefore, making us to conclude that aspirations that are very far ahead serve as the best incentives for investments. And kind of we did some heterogeneity analysis where we look at the different kinds of livestock, grouping them into very large livestock, but also small livestock and poultry. And we saw that what matters is not just any kind of livestock, but it's actually investments in cattle. And in exploring some mechanisms that could explain this relationship, we saw that the internal locus of control matters as a mediator. So what is internal locus of control? It is the control, or it's the belief that you control your life and not just stochastic or external factors. So now let's get into the matter. So basically, I know I've been talking a lot about aspirations, and I would assume that since this is a behavioral session, everybody understands what aspirations, but the Oxford Dictionary defines aspirations as the hope or ambition of achieving something. So basically, these are goals to which individuals invest a lot of time, money, and effort for their attainment. And one big difference here is the fact that aspirations are future-oriented and exclude present-level gratification. So I give an example. So after this presentation, you may be hungry and you go grab a pizza. That will not pass for an aspiration, but the desire for you to be food secure, so to say, in the future, passes for an aspiration. And the next level of differentiation is that aspirations are not expectations. So aspirations are more idealistic, while expectations are more realistic, in kind of enveloping a lot of beliefs and probabilities. So aspirations is more about the possibilities, while expectations is about the probabilities. As La Ferrara highlighted, aspirations internalize constraints, but aspirations do not. And as an economist, if we have this kind of constraints, then we say aspirations need not be rational. So for our data, so this was data I collected in 2019 in 35 villages in Kenya, where I used this probability proportional to size sampling framework, multi-stage selecting households directly. And for the measurement of aspirations, we relied on the Bernard and Tafesse framework, which is a well-tested framework for measuring aspirations. So basically, I didn't represent all his questions here, but he normally has 5 questions, or they normally have 5 questions, where they also do this thing of anchoring. So they ask you your maximum, what is the maximum aspirations for people in this village? What is the minimum? So these 2 questions are used as just anchoring. So to kind of put the individuals in a realistic range. But the real questions for aspirations and for computing the gap are the questions: what income level you have at present, and what income level you would like to have in the future. And from this, when you construct it, it bounds the value to be between 0 and 1, which enables comparison between households. And for our investments, we looked at livestock, and we kind of did a lot of heterogeneity analysis. First of all, we just had this dummy whether households were owning livestock or not, but we also have head size, and beyond the head size, we also converted this using this FAO livestock unit, the tropical livestock, where a cattle which is very big, has a bigger life mass, has a lot of weight, and the small animals are also going to get lesser weight. And beyond this, we did some truncations at 0 because we have households that do not have any livestock, and we never wanted to have the feeling that these zeros are biasing our results. And beyond truncating at zeros, we try to manage these zeros effectively using this inverse hyperbolic sign transformation. And for our empirical strategy, we did both parametric and non-parametric estimations, where kind of parametric, we follow the normal functional form, where we allowed this aspiration gap to get into the model in its quadratic term. But also beyond the parametric, we did some parametric estimations where we allowed the data to speak. So beyond imposing this functional form, because, you know, we are building on a relationship which is inverse U, and if we're looking at the inverse U, then we have to square the aspiration terms. But beyond that, we just allow the data speak. So let's see whether we can observe this U-shaped relationship even without imposing any prior functional form. And to make sure that we're very certain in what we're doing, we also did some U-shaped tests following the procedures of Lin and Mellum. And we're also interested in mediation analysis. So what could explain the fact that households that aspire, or households that have very high aspirations, they reduce their investments after a threshold? So we considered interaction effects. We also did this sequential G estimation. And to be sure that unobserved heterogeneity was not biasing our results, we kind of estimated this Oster bounds that kind of generates bounds that tells us how omitted variable bias is able to roll away our estimated effects. And for robustness, like I mentioned, we did some heterogeneity using the different kinds of livestock, either large livestock, but also small livestock, but also poultry, to see which one is more responsive to aspirations. So just the results so far. So when we look at the parametric estimation, when we imposed this prior functional form, allowing the aspiration gap to get in as a square, we first of all kind of estimated the model with and without controls to see whether unobserved heterogeneity has anything to do. Of course, using with and without controls could tell us a lot about the stability of the conscience of the coefficients, because if we can observe differences when we use the controls and not the controls, then it means there's a lot of bias even just arising from observed heterogeneity. And most of the times you allow observed heterogeneity to inform us about unobserved heterogeneity. So when we look at the results, we see that from the parametric estimation, we get this confirmation of this inverse U-shaped, both when we use controls and not controls. And we now look at the various U-shaped tests that enables us to look at the various turning points. So what is the threshold beyond which aspirations are definitely going to lead to a reduction in livestock investments? And we established, or we estimate various p-values for the turning points. And if you look at so far, the turning point is around 0.48. And this is highly significant when we look at the Sashabuchi p-square, which really tells us that, and we also estimate the slopes at the maximum and the minimum, which tells us that our inverse U-shaped relationship is actually confirmed in the case of livestock investments in Kenya. But beyond this, again, we did this non-parametric estimation where we just allow the data talk, no imposing any prior functional form. And from that, you could see, I mean, it's really not an exact U-shape, but it moves already in the expected direction without anything. So you see that livestock are increasing with increasing the aspiration gap up to a certain point, and which confirms the U-shaped test, up to like 0.4, then it reduces beyond. And that's when we look at the livestock units, but also this is when we look at the herd size. And for unobserved selection, we wanted to be sure that we're not getting any bias estimates, but it's hard to think of the fact that unobserved bias could be driving the relationship between aspirations and livestock investments. But we did these Osterbound regressions to show that that was not the case. And when we look at that, we estimate both beta and delta values. So what do the beta values tell us? So these beta values are adjusted coefficients. So they tell us that if unobserved heterogeneity was a problem in the analysis, what value of beta we're going to get, and we get beta values that are very similar to the estimated beta values. So this is more or less just an upper bound of what we get. So this kind of tells us that unobserved heterogeneity is not a problem in the analysis. But also when we look at the data values, which tells us how large unobserved heterogeneity is to be relative to observed heterogeneity to bias our results, we see that it has to be like 6 times to be able to bias our results. And with this, it gives us more confidence that omitted variable, it's not biasing our results. So, and for the mechanism, we tested what are locus of control, which is defined as the belief that individuals have control over outcomes in their lives matter. And we could see that, yes, it could be a mechanism explaining the results, because we also see a reduction in the locus of control. And yeah, I just presented the results, but we did a lot of interactions with locus of control. We did direct effects, and I couldn't present all this because of time. So far, we've been able to establish that psychological and behavioral factors matter for future-oriented outcomes. In our case, livestock investments, which represents rural wealth in many communities, especially in Kenya, which is a pastoral community, households store their wealth in livestock. When we're there in the field, a household will tell you, I have 10 cattle, then I'm a very rich man. So if aspirations are that important and they matter, then we've established that the psychological factors matter, but there should be no narrow focus on aspirations, because as we've seen, beyond a certain point, it rather leads to this investment. So we want to push aspirations to a point beyond which it doesn't lead to any negative outcomes. And now, if you're looking at this, then since aspirations matter, so it definitely starts from where you are. So if you look at the way we constructed a gap, it looks at your current level of income, and from that's where it starts. Then it's important that relaxing both external and internal constraints really go hand in hand. So we are not saying that we should just concentrate a lot on aspirations and kick away the normal poverty reduction instruments like cash transfers, but this should go hand in hand. It should be more or less very complementary. And we also reinforce the role of other psychological constraints like locus of control. So I leave that for the discussion. Okay, thank you very much. So of course, like every other study, we have some limitations and future outlook, and I'm happy I'm still working on some things relating to this. So we want to guide the understanding of work from a rural perspective, and we don't want to overgeneralize our findings, but like researchers would also argue that this work can be applicable to any pastoral zones that face the same structural constraints like the zones in Kenya. And we considered a lot of dimensions of aspirations, but it's important that we get more qualitative aspects of aspirations, just beyond income aspirations, but also different aspects of aspirations like health, security, environmental sustainability. And yeah, we don't, if throughout the presentation I mentioned anything that has to do with causality, you have to forgive me at this point in time. So thank you very much.
2 minutes for questions.
You said that you're looking at investments, right? And
Yes.
The relationship between aspirations at this moment and investments. But then you're looking at herd size as the variable. How do you do that?
So kind of it's the market in Kenya is working. So kind of households rapidly sell and invest. So it's not a case that, so maybe I should call it savings, but it's not a case that households just keep the livestock always wanting and The point is in Kenya, depending on the kind of constraints farmers are facing, they actually invest and disinvest. So they have an active livestock market, so they keep selling and keep buying. So that's why we're considering head size at that particular point in time. So what do you have at that particular point in time, assuming that the markets are functioning and you could actually sell and you could actually buy?
Okay, we run out of time next. Thank you, Martin.
Okay.
Manuel. ¿Cuál es?
Creo que sí está.
Espérame, ábrela con él.
Sí, ese es. Okay, thank you. Hello again. This is my second paper. My co-author didn't count, so I'm here again. So this is a paper with Jose Gabriel Castillo from the SPOL in Ecuador, Manuel Hernandez from IFPRI at Washington, D.C. And basically on this paper, what we're trying to do is assess the impact of COVID-19 initial confinement on individual and social preferences in Guatemala, in rural Guatemala. So the motivation of the paper is pretty clear in the sense that the pandemic and the containment measures provokes many psychological and financial stresses, particularly among vulnerable populations, and dramatically change human interactions that could affect people's attitudes and perceptions. So we want to examine the effect of COVID-19 initial confinement, as I said, on households, individual and social preferences in rural Guatemala. In the case of Guatemala, in many countries, the central government imposed a nationwide lockdown and also daily curfews from 6 p.m. to 5 a.m. And in general, the containment measures in Guatemala were one of the highest in the region. No? There is a government stringency index, which measures the degree of strictness of the containment measures, and they were, I think, the second in Central America after Honduras. And on top of that, several rural communities in Guatemala also self-confined. They restricted their entry and exit during the initial months of the pandemic. So we focus on before-after changes on 5 domains: risk aversion, trust, generosity, emotional problems, and intra-household relationships. The data is comprised of 1,824 agricultural smallholders. They are located across 75 communities in the Western Highlands of Guatemala. These are 3 departments: Huehuetenango, San Marcos, and Quiché. For people that don't know Guatemala, this area is the area with the highest poverty rates, over 60% of poverty rate, and also stunting, chronic malnutrition is over 50% in those areas. And this is basically the dots represents the communities that were, where the smallholders were located and that were interviewed during 2 survey rounds. The first round was done in November, December 2019, which was a baseline survey. And the same people were interviewed again on May, June 2020 as a follow-up. In this case, the sample is mainly composed of male smallholders. Basically, over 83% of them are male. Most of them are coffee producers. And you will see that the red dots represent the communities that restricted their entry and exit during the first months of the pandemic, which is the majority of them. Basically, 80% of the communities, 4 out of 5, basically restricted their entry and exit during the initial months of the pandemic. So this is just a simple view of the before-after changes in these 5 domains. And we basically observe, and these were kind of striking results in terms of, we observe a significant increase in risk tolerance on a scale 0 to 10 on the willingness to take risks. Basically, we find a 1.8 point increase from 4 to 5.8, basically. There is also a deterioration of perceptions regarding trust and generosity. In terms of distrust, on a scale 1 to 4, there is a 0.5 point increase. On the generosity or people perception about people and willingness to help, there is a 0.2 points increase, and also emotional problems increase by 0.5. And the one where we don't observe any changes is the intra-household relationship issues, no? But of course, that variable can also be correlated with the social desirability bias, no? That when we ask questions about household relationships, this could be subject to a potential bias. We also did some local polynomial plots just to see whether these changes in preferences, individual and social preferences, vary by income. And basically here you can observe the gray line is basically before the start of COVID-19. The red line is after the start of COVID-19. And we basically find that preferences were not much influenced by income level. The curves are kind of flat, except for the willingness to take risks. Before the pandemic is kind of upward sloping, which indicates that people of relatively higher incomes were more willing to take risks prior to the pandemic. And we basically see a rather uniform increase on scores over a wide income range. No? When we compare the gray line to the red line, it's kind of a uniform increase in these four indicators of preference. The one we don't report is the intra-household relationship, because that one we didn't find major changes over time. So the next question that we asked and that we want to respond is basically where these changes, okay, so with income, apparently there's no correlations, but we wanted to know where these changes in preferences can be associated with certain factors, no? And by factors, we mean where something happened or there was an episode at the household level, an adverse situation at the household level, the level of exposure to the virus, and also whether there were differences between households that were located in communities that self-confine or not self-confine. So those, and basically we run this regression where the parameter of interest is the beta 3, which is going to capture these possible differentiated variations in preferences among households exposed to a specific situation. Again, a household adverse situation, the level of exposure to the virus, or whether the household was located in a community that's self-confined. Regarding the first set of results, this is associations with a household adverse situation. So we correlated these changes or assessed if there was any correlation in these preference changes with a reported decrease in income, in agricultural income, which is the main income source of these households. That's panel A. Panel B, if there is an association with a reported decrease in the household dietary diversity. And panel C, if whether there is any reported association with a severe food insecure experience. No? By a severe food insecure experience, we mean where the household reported any episode during the first month of COVID-19 where they felt hungry, but they couldn't eat because they didn't have resources to get food, no? At some point during the first months of the pandemic. And basically what we observe here is that there are some correlations, basically a decrease in income and in dietary diversity is correlated with higher emotional problems and intra-household relationship issues. And you can see this here, right here. Basically, remember the parameter of interest is interaction between the dummy variable identifying the pandemic period plus this particular episode that the household suffered. No? And on panel C, besides this positive correlation with more emotional problems and household relationship issues, we also tend to see a lower increase in the perceived level of distrust and generosity. No? And one of the assessments that we did, which is in the paper, is basically that households that reported a severe food insecure experience were also households that reported more aid, that they received more aid, either from the government or from private institutions. No? So that could in some way attenuate this higher increase that we observe in general in terms of distrust and generosity. It was attenuated up to some point in this household that experienced a severe food insecure experience. In terms of association with the level of exposure to the virus, we also did some regressions where we included the level of cases of COVID-19 cases at the municipality level, and also the level, the number of COVID-19 deaths at the municipality level, no? Normalizing, of course, by the amount of the population in each area. No? And we find also that The degree of exposure to the virus seemed to have played some role. More exposure attenuated the higher overall risk tolerance. The risk tolerance increased to a lower degree among areas or across areas that were more exposed to the virus. And more exposure also exacerbated negative perceptions about trust and generosity, emotional issues, and household interrelationship problems. Finally, we also assess correlations between changes in preferences and self-confinement, whether the household was located in one of these communities that self-confined, which was the majority of households in our sample. And we find that more stringent local containment measures, households located in communities that self-confined, mainly affected risk tolerance. Basically, households in communities that impose extra mobility restrictions show a lower increase in their risk tolerance. And here it's also important to say that I don't show that here, but prior to the pandemic, there were no differences in the risk tolerance between households located in community that closed and that remain open. So basically this change happened later, and in the map that I showed before also, we don't see also a geographic pattern where some communities in certain locations close and others remain open. It's kind of dispersed also, which also potentially rule out other sources of bias or exposure bias to the virus that could explain these results. So to conclude, basically, this study showing that household preferences over risk aversion, trust, and generosity generally deteriorated in rural Guatemala following the onset of the pandemic. There is an important increase in the willingness to take more risks, worsening of social perceptions about interpersonal trust and generosity, and also a higher frequency of emotional problems. When we try to assess whether these changes can be correlated with certain factors, we find that experiencing an adverse situation at the household level, a higher degree of exposure to the virus, and more stringent local confinement measures shape several of the variations in preference. Two important comments to conclude is the first one is that we are relying here on self-reported preference indicators. Ideally, we would like to have used monetary incentive mechanisms, but of course, due to the pandemic, we couldn't rely on that kind of experiments or instruments. Remember that this is poor rural areas located in isolated communities, so the surveys were done over the phone. And the other thing that I want to mention is that we have collected also 2 additional survey rounds, and that's going to be incorporated also into the analysis. And one of the results that we're getting is that these shifts in preferences are not temporal, but appear to be permanent. Like even we're talking about 2 years after the start of the pandemic, because we have done a follow-up in 2021 and another one in 2022 to the same households, and we're still getting higher willingness to take risks and higher levels of distrust, and also people's perceptions about generosity. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
We have time for 3 or 4 questions.
Yes, so thank you. So just a clarification issue. The first one, your data was collected before COVID-19 or after COVID-19?
Baseline was before November, December 2019.
Yes. Then my second question is, I don't know whether the current war in Ukraine affected Guatemala, but could that be something that is also explaining this persistent social-emotional skills? But also, could it be the fact that even after COVID, households have still not atrophied, or kind of so, like the main mechanisms you found out with that households have lost income, they're not food insecure? Could it be the fact that, of course, even before COVID, most households were always food insecure? Could it be the fact that this was just the normal things beyond COVID?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, on the first one, I also want to comment that we did the baseline in November, December 2019, and this sample corresponds to also to a survey we're doing, collecting a baseline survey and follow-up surveys to evaluate another program. So part of the sample are beneficiaries of a value chain program and part are not beneficiaries. No, that's important. But We don't find differences between both of them also. Of course, I mean, I didn't have time to present the results here about that. So that's also important to mention. And yeah, about what you mentioned, yeah, we're finding, and also we have other papers that some of them are already published, that we show that these households have been exposed not only to COVID-19, no, also in 2020 they were exposed to two severe storms, tropical storms that affected part of the area, Eta and Iota, which hit hard Central America, and also yeah, that also involved not only income losses, crop losses, but also more food insecure episodes and a decrease in dietary diversity. Now that said, in 2021, we start to see some recovery in dietary diversity and in incomes, for example, no, compared to 2020, no. And it's curious because yeah, we are seeing recovery in some of these variables, these outcome variables, but on the preferences, at least from the preliminary analysis that we have done, we're not seeing that reversal in preferences. So apparently the preferences have shifted kind of permanently, while the outcome variables that initially saw a big decrease, they are starting to recover over time. No? Of course, this year we also had to take into account the conflict in East Europe. No? So that's also something that we had to add also to the analysis. But yeah, but that's something, yeah, and we want to explore that in more detail once we start running regressions and do a more in-depth analysis. Thank you. I don't know if there is other questions. Or...
Thank you.
Okay,
next,
thank you.
Next
I will not stand up again.
next we have agenda. 15 plus 3 minutes for question. Yeah.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Dienda, and today I'm going to present, actually it's the first paper of my dissertation, which is titled Preferences for Replanting Subsidy Programs Among Indonesian Oil Palm Smallholders. Yeah, in Indonesia, 41% of the oil palm plantations are managed by smallholder farmers. And actually, these plantations are currently already old. Because when they're old, over 25 years old, let's say, they produce less and they need to be replanted. But replanting is costly for the smallholder farmers, and therefore policy instruments such as subsidies have been offered to assist these smallholders with replanting. However, they receive only low number of participants. Yeah, it has limited success, as you can see here in this graph. So there's a subsidy program from the government, and they have a target of 180,000 hectares to be replanted every year. But so far, the target has not been reached. And this target has not been reached not because of there's no money for the subsidy, but because people don't really apply for the program. So it was analyzed and evaluated. So the program prerequisites was actually a bit complicated. They have 14 points to be fulfilled by the smallholders, so they can actually apply for this program. But then in 2019, actually, this prerequisites has been simplified from 14 requirements to 2 requirements only, but still the targeted area was not reached. So I'm just wondering why these kind of interventions could be not successful, because it's actually basically a subsidy, it's a free money. But yeah, so a study by Scott and also a study by Zoomer said that these unsuccessful interventions could be because of the misperception of the way people get by and get things done. So they changed the prerequisites, but I think that we should look from a different perspective, and we should better understand the characteristic of the smallholders themselves. So yeah, my research question is basically to what extent does heterogeneity in characteristics influence smallholders' decision-making and preferences in a replanting subsidy program. So in this study, we posit that there are heterogeneity or latent heterogeneity in the characteristics of the smallholder farmers. And these characteristics can make a difference in how they make decisions, especially here in this case, in a replanting subsidy program. So to see the latent heterogeneity, I use this framework, and I'm assuming maybe most of the people here already heard about this sustainable livelihood approach. It's a dynamic concept for understanding the livelihoods of rural people, where in this concept, the factors that constrain or enhance livelihood opportunities are organized and show how they are related. And so people are here, smallholder farmers, they have different access to capital assets, such as financial, physical, natural, human, and social assets, where they act as building blocks that can be combined to choose different strategies to create livelihoods. And so by using this framework, it helps illustrate the way people manage to go through challenges and difficulties. And therefore, this framework makes it suitable to see from the perspective how we can avert this misperception of the way people get things done. So here's the framework. And here, based on this framework, we created an index basically to calculate or measure the resilience or the livelihood assets that's within the smallholder farmers. So we based our framework on the study of Quant. She studied also smallholder farmers in Africa. So we created an index for each of the livelihood assets. So every respondent here will have an index for their financial capital, for their human capital, natural capital, physical and social capital. And the indicators here were based on the study of Quant, as I have mentioned, but also based on our experiences in the field, and also based on the context of the oil palm smallholders themselves. So here you can see the indicators. And so the index was quite simple. We didn't do any weightings when we are creating the index. Therefore, I will maybe later explain this is a little bit of limitation of the study as well, but also the point of doing this is to see the direction or to see the big picture of how the livelihood assets actually affect their choices. Yeah, so the data itself was collected last year, end of last year in Jambi province, Indonesia, where we interviewed 249 smallholder farmers, oil palm smallholder farmers. So we did a survey. We have questions on perceptions and knowledge. We did a discrete choice experiment to elicit their preferences in a replanting subsidy program. And also we have questions on socio-demographic. For the data analysis, we do it 2 steps. So the first step is to see the latent heterogeneity by creating the livelihood asset composite index. And then these index we use to reveal the latent heterogeneity with the latent class analysis. And then after we have the clusters and the clusters, we analyze the econometric model for each of the latent classes. So this is the design of the discrete choice experiment. So we have here 5 attributes that is relevant for the replanting subsidy program. So we selected these attributes also first based on the currently available subsidy program, but also this study is hypothetical. So we consider other attributes that are relevant. We did pre-test, and after 2 pre-tests and literature reviews, and also from online focus group discussions, we chose these 5 attributes and these levels for the discrete choice experiment. And here, the 5th attribute tree that must be planted is also something like a trade-off, because in the real replanting subsidy program that's happening right now, there's no trade-off attribute. So I'm curious whether the farmers, if they can get a subsidy money, would they diversify their oil palm plantation, because most of them are currently monoculture. So yeah, because these farmers, they own or they manage different age of plantations, we need to control for them. Therefore, we have a scenario, and we tell them to imagine before playing the discrete choice experiment. Let's say if your plantation is now 25 years old and they already require replanting. And if replanting costs you 35 million rupiahs, which is roughly $2,300, and a replanting subsidy program was offered, which subsidy would you choose? So here is one of the choice sets, one of 12 choice sets that were presented. So this is an unlabeled discrete choice experiment with one opt-out option. So yeah, this is the mixed logit model. And here are the results. So the top results were the results from the latent class analysis. So the first step, we wanted to know the heterogeneity based on the livelihood assets. So the latent class analysis suggests that there are 4 classes within our respondents. And as you can see here, the spider web graphics show each livelihood asset index, the average of the livelihood asset index for each of the classes. So 23% of our respondents can be interpreted as vulnerable smallholders because they have the lowest livelihood asset index. I didn't show it, the average here, but later in the next slide. So yeah, as you can see, these smallholders, they have relatively low financial capital than the others, also relatively low human capital than the others, relatively low also social capital. And yeah, for natural capital, as you can see, it's not so different between the classes, and also the physical capital. Yeah, so these vulnerable smallholders, the way they make their choices in the discrete choice experiment is that the only attribute that matters to them is the amount of subsidy and the funding from the Islamic banking. Here, funding, we have, I didn't explain this previously, but for the funding, we have three levels: from the government, from Islamic banking, and from the international funding such as EU or the USAID. But here, yeah, the amount of subsidy is the only, let's say, the most significant attribute for them. So for the second category, was interpreted as self-reliant smallholders, and it's 40% of the respondents. And here, they're interpreted as self-reliant because outside of social capital, outside of social and financial capital, they have relatively quite good assets. Yeah, and for them, the type of funding actually matters. So they prefer local or from the government or from the Islamic banking, but not from the relative to the funding from the international. From international. And the third category is actually it's only 9% of our respondents, and they are interpreted as social smallholders. So for them, they are actually the only group that statistically significantly prefers to join the subsidy program. For the others, they don't really choose in our sample. But it's only 9% of the respondents in our sample. So this is quite interesting. And the fourth class is interpreted as established smallholders because they have the most well-rounded livelihood assets. And here the amount of subsidy also matters for them, but also the funding, and also for them group-based registration. But they don't significantly choose to join the subsidy program. So yeah, here are the scores of the livelihood assets. So yeah, the results from the latent class analysis were linked to the results of the mixed logit model for each class. So yeah, for vulnerable smallholders, yeah, with their low level of financial capital in hand, the amount of subsidy is almost the only thing that significantly matters for them. And for the second level, second class self-reliant smallholders, they prefer government or Islamic banking funded funding schemes, and their high level of human capital might reflect the high trust in the national system due to the combination of good education, experience, and health, as they are indicators of the human capital. So as mentioned before, the only group statistically significantly joining the subsidy program are the social smallholders, which are only, unfortunately, 9% of the respondents. So the combination of strong preferences for the group-based subsidy program might reflect the importance of collective action and peer effect for this class. So they might rely higher on society to make decisions, in this case, to join a subsidy program. And for the last group, they have the most well-rounded capital, but relatively lower social capital. And they do not choose to join the subsidy program. So the conclusion is that there is latent characteristic heterogeneity within the respondents, and different set of livelihood assets illustrates different preference pattern on a replanting subsidy program. And from the results, we can conclude that the high influence of social livelihood asset on the willingness to join subsidy program suggests that strengthening of institutions, for example, like facilitating and managing farmer groups, might be the key to improvement in participation, because as the motivation before changing the requirements of the subsidy program really didn't change anything. So we have to go bottom up and strengthen the institutions for facilitation. And so, understanding the characteristics of the smallholders, especially these capabilities or these assets, might be beneficial for designing a more efficient and tailored subsidy program. But then again, heterogeneity might be a challenge for the government or stakeholders for developing a suiting subsidy program because it's very hard to satisfy all types of smallholders. So thank you.
Time for a couple of questions.
So thank you very much. I think I have two questions. So the first one, I think I heard you mentioning that there is the possibility that farmers kind of diversify in their crop.
Yep.
Is your data collection in Zambia?
Yeah.
Because I mean, so far when I read a lot of papers from Zambia, I understand that the only diversification they can do is to do rubber, and rubber seems to be a less profitable crop than oil.
Yeah.
So how does that play out?
Yeah, that's why this is also hypothetical, because this is my first paper also. I want to see the trees. So in the discrete choice experiment itself, we asked before, like, the definition of tree. What is tree? It is, we give examples. For example, in Indonesian, it's called sungkai, or the other fruit trees. So the definition here, tree for them is already not understory plants. So from this, we also want to see the trade-offs. Let's say, what if the subsidy that was offered was higher, the amount, would they prefer to plant more trees or not? Or would they take that program or not? Yeah, so that's how it was defined. But sorry, in Jambi, there is no really outside of the beta plots that were done by the efforts project. They have now beta plots that are they're testing whether the trees can grow in the oil palm plantation. But smallholders don't really practice it right now.
Okay, so now the diversification is mostly in terms of plantation crops and nothing to do with food crops.
No.
Okay. Yeah, because that brings me to the next question. Because I mean, I'm wondering why households are not wanting to take the subsidy program, right? Do you think there's an aspect of risk in it? I mean, because oil palm also takes some time to grow, to materialize, and to start getting you. And you're not sure. I mean, households are very risk averse. So how did you consider risk so far in your analysis?
So the oil palm needs 3 years to produce. Therefore, I have this attribute actually that helps to capture that. So here, replanting method, gradual or whole plantation. So they can choose to replant gradually, therefore they don't lose their income at once because they're replant. Let's say it was mentioned like this gradual in the explanation that this gradual is like yearly, therefore you also get the money yearly instead of getting it like the whole, let's say 30 million at once, let's say for the subsidy. So that should capture whether they would like to replant at once or gradually.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'm the last but not least. Let's see, where's my presentation? Gonna make Bear with me for a minute. I'm gonna make a couple last minute changes. I'm gonna tell you why in a sec. Okay, this one is definitely not going here. I don't want to repeat. Basically, I'm really fascinated by Martin's study because we did something pretty similar with both of us. So I will try not to bore you again with the same theory that Martin already covered spectacularly. I really appreciate actually going after you because now for some reason I cannot edit this, so you will see me playing around with the slides anyways.
You could edit the subscription.
Oh yeah, well, whatever. So that you will have me here. Anyways, well, thank you for coming today. I know Tuesday people already left, so but anyways, my name is Alexis Villasis. I'm an assistant professor at Arizona State University. I'm going to be presenting on aspirations too, but also we explore a little bit risk preferences and agricultural investments. So we conducted some field experiments in Ecuador. This is a current work with Jeffrey Blum from the ERS and with Ashok Mishra that is also at Arizona State University. And this is a quote that I stole from Travis Lever yesterday, right? So I really like it how he introduces how he mentioned this quote from Viktor Frankl that says, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in a given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. So basically this line of thought has motivated, as Martin already mentioned, during the last 6-7 years, a lot of work where developing economists are linking measures of hope in their empirical studies with different outcomes, right? So this is actually grounded on the pioneering work proposed by Amartya Sen and by Snyder, where they link hope with measures of material prosperity. So hope is assumed to be as a way of thought, and as a way of thought, it has kind of 3 dimensions: agency, pathways, and aspirations. So we in economics love to focus on aspirations because we can model this. Modeling pathways and agency is really hard in a utility framework, so we don't deal with that. So that's why we mainly, that's one of the reasons why we focus on aspirations. It can be modeled as subjective expectation with a reference-dependent utility function, pretty much in the same spirit as prospect theory. And Martin already mentioned this, the concept of aspiration has been linked with investments in different dimensions, specifically in education, on employment, on enterprise. And there are some new literature that is emerging on also on gender issues and aspirations. So just reinforcing what Martin already mentioned, the thing about aspirations is that they can be too low or too high to influence investments, right? So this type of relationship between aspirations and different outcomes, as I already mentioned, has been explored in several domains, but agriculture has been one of those sectors or subjects that has not been really linked with the concepts of aspirations. So we have the current excellent work from Martin, and there are a couple more papers that I know about that are also working on aspirations. So this is kind of new in the realm of agriculture, and it makes sense because In agriculture, we like to do investments, specifically in investments in technologies that you can also call adoption of agricultural technology, which is at the end of the day. So anything that can affect adoption of agricultural technology is of interest, specifically for people working on development economics, right? So what we do in this research, well, we study the same thing as Marty already mentioned in his paper, the relationship between aspirations and investments in agricultural technology. I think one of the few things that differentiates my study with Martin is that we account for the role of risk preferences. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. We do this in a different context. Martin, again, he did it with cattle farmers in Kenya. It was really cool example. We do it instead with cacao farmers in Ecuador. We also run these risk preference experiments with them in the field. And we test for this theoretical prediction implied in the work of Jenny and Ray in their 2017 econometrica paper, where they demonstrate this inverted U-shaped relationship between the income aspirations gap and investments. So what did we find? Well, we found same thing as Martin. We found that this U-inverted relationship exists, but it is this U-inverted relationship exists even when we account for the role of risk preferences, which is a classical topic since the 80s when Biggs Wagner came out with their way that elicit risk preferences and link it with technology adoption. Then it's been evolving over time, not only using expected utility, but now there is this popular paper by Liu 2013, I think, where they use prospect theory to model also adoption of technology. So we account for that, and we see that the U-inverted relationship exists even when we account for this, because that was one of the main criticisms, at least in agricultural technology, when we were doing a pilot of these experiments. Like, yeah, you think it's aspirations, but you know, some of the people that review our paper was like, no, we think that this is risk preferences. So that was one of the motivations for why we control for risk preferences. We also try to differentiate or examine some heterogeneity, and cacao farming is really nice to examine this. We differentiate between long-term investments and short-term investments. So the thing about cacao is that after you plant the cacao tree, you need to wait 4 or 5 years until you harvest. So we use plantation renovation as our proxy for investments in the long term. It's relatively long term, 4 or 5 years. So after a farmer plants, he needs to wait at least 4 or 5 years. And we compare this with what we call short-term investments, which is normally fertilizer use, which, you know, at least in cacao operations, you need to fertilize way in advance, 5 months in advance before, you know, you harvest, right? So those are our two proxies for short-term investments and long-term investments. And what we find is that this U-inverted relationship exists only for long-term investments, which makes sense because the other literature in the other fields like education also shows this in the context of long-term investments. So we see that this type of relationship also holds in agriculture. Well, what are the main contributions of our paper? Well, again, we are trying to investigate this, even accounting for the role of risk preferences. We also examine heterogeneity that can be attributed by, you know, the payoff of investment, short-term versus long-term. I was expecting to skip this, but given Martin already covered a lot of the aspiration concepts, I'm gonna go a little deep in this. I'll give you more flavor of what's the concept of aspiration. Aspirations, think about this as a line or as a goal, right? And if you achieve this line or this goal, you experience what we call bonus utility. So here in this expected utility framework, so here is this W. So when your level of income in this case is greater than this line or than this goal, it says that you achieve or you realize your aspirations, right? So you experience bonus utility. But when your level of income falls below this line or this goal, you don't experience this bonus utility, and it says that aspirations are frustrated. So that's pretty much the spirit of the aspiration concept, how it is modeled. We also base our study on the concept of the aspiration gap, which is just creating an index between how much people want to earn versus how much they earn right now, divided by how much they want to earn. So this naturally, as Martin already explained, bounds this index between 0 and 1, and its use is pretty handy because you can compare farms from different sizes, right? So the aspirations of a farmer in Ecuador who has less than an hectare is way different than the aspiration that someone who has, like, I don't know, 300 hectares, right? In monetary terms, but when we use this index, we can make better comparisons. So to account for risk preferences, we use the prospect theory framework. And why do we use this? Because actually the way that Jenny and Ray modeled their aspirations a utility function is based on prospect theory because it has a reference dependent point. Pretty much it's prospect theory. When I'm not going to spend here too much time, but I just want to highlight that prospect theory help us estimate not only risk aversion, but also loss aversion and probability distortion. So which are some nice features that we can include in our study. We conduct this in 5 provinces of Ecuador. Ecuador is one of the largest producers, the 3rd or 4th largest producer of cacao in the world, but it's the largest producer of this specific type of cacao called a specialty cacao. So we have a representative sample of around 523 farmers from 25 villages. Here I'm just showing you some statistics or graphic statistics in this case of our aspirations gap. What we found is was pretty much very well distributed. And what also we found interesting is that when we plot the aspirations gap against the current monthly income, we see that the aspirations gap tends to be higher for those who have very low income. So which actually makes sense because, you know, if someone is earning $100, he definitely wants to double his income or triple his income, right? Versus some guys, for example, we have guys around here that earns more than $6,000 a month. Probably they don't want to double their income, right? They already, more than surely, they are covering all their basic needs in Ecuador with this type of income. Okay, I'm gonna skip this because this was the short version. So I'm gonna jump here. Okay, so I'm gonna show you 2 sets of results. First is the one where we link the aspirations gap and long-term investments. Remember that for long-term investments, we use fund renovation expenditures in cacao operations as our proxy. And we control not only for, we do 2 types of exercises. We control for prospective risk preferences, but also for alternative risk-taking attitudes. In this case, we use the DOS per investing index. If you're not really familiar with it, it's pretty famous in psychological literature. Basically measures, you know, risk attitude of people in different domains, in health domain, in investment domain, those type of things, right? So we use the specific domain for investing. But we actually measure the whole thing. It was a little challenging because, for example, some of the questions that these DOSPER scale ask in the realm of, you know, health behavior, they ask people if when they have sexual relationships, they use condoms, which is not a really common question you ask, you know, in the countryside in Ecuador, right? So farmers, you know, tend to be either they will laugh or either they will be a little defensive. So for you to have an idea, right? So this DOSPER scale has on a scale from 1 to 7, where they say, okay, not likely or very likely, right? So from 0 to, I mean, from 1 to 7. So when we control for this type of risk attitude behavior, we still find that the aspiration gap and the income and the square aspiration gap is pretty strong, significant, positive and negative, which give us, you know, first evidence that this U-inverted relationship holds. We also estimate the turning point, and we find that it's pretty strongly significant. Like Martin did, we also estimate Oster bounds. They are really strong, 16 and 14. Basically, these Oster results tell us that unobservables in our regression specification need to be 14 to 16 times stronger than the variables that we have included in our regression to, you know, invalidate our results. So that was the first exercise we did. We also when we control for prospective risk preferences, we found the same results. So regardless of the type of risk attitude of risk preferences that you control for, this U-inverted relationship holds. But when we take into account short-term investments, which is fertilizer expenditures, this relationship doesn't hold. Neither for when we control for the DOS per investing index, which is, you know, the regression here in column 5, or where we control for prospective risk preferences, there is no relationship at all. The only thing that actually came significant was the parameter of risk aversion for short-term investment, which makes sense. I mean, at least in the literature, what they have shown in this case is that risk aversion in this case stops farmers in this case from making investments in technology adoption, in seeds, or in fertilizer expenditures. We also run some point I left this. Oh yeah, the non-parametric regression, and you see the same results here. This non-parametric regression, basically, we do not force any specific form. Remember that in regression, in our basic regression, we put a linear term and a quadratic term for the aspiration gap. In this one, we just put a polynomial and let the aspiration gap to take any form the aspiration gap wants. So again, we find strong evidence that for at least panel A, which represents long-term investments, the U-shaped relationship holds. But for fertilizer expenditures, which is our proxy for short-term investment, this relationship doesn't have like a U-shaped relationship that we were expecting. So We found it's interesting, actually aligns with the literature, which has been, discussed in education and enterprise performance. And we drive, well, a couple of conclusions from here. We found out, or at least we provide evidence that the length of the payoff schedule represents an important source of heterogeneity in understanding how aspirations influence agricultural investments. So probably for short-term investments, risk preference play a stronger role than actually aspirations. But for long-term investments, it seems like aspirations help explain a little, at least in some part, how or why farmers engage in some type of activities. What else we have here? Well, we also have the same conclusion that Martin arrived to his study, that aspirations that are ahead, but not too far ahead. Remember that there is a inverted relationship. So there is an optimal point. After that point, your investments are going to decrease because your aspirations are frustrated. So aspirations serve as an incentive for relatively long-term investments in agriculture. And this, help us at least conclude that, policy interventions that normally focus on subsidies, on contract farming, might be help in this case if it has some additional component related with, behavior and psychological constraints such as aspirations. And that's pretty much it. Okay. First question, and then we have that.
I don't know if you're familiar with like vocational literature.
No, not really.
Okay, so a lot of the time this just reminds me a lot of what's going on there. A lot of the time people like results, right? So they're trying to put like some technical aspect on those training programs to try to increase their effectiveness. And so they just got like different technologies, like there's not a lot of effectiveness for technical.
Yeah.
Reasons are. I'm just curious, like, how effective you actually think that like say some sort of training in like some psychological aspect.
Martin covered this a little bit in his presentation. We need to be really careful because we don't know how these psychological interventions are going to notch the aspirations. Yeah. So if you notch the aspirations too far, remember that there is a U-shaped relationship. If you go too far, then you will actually harm people. So there is a working paper 2021 World Bank guys. I forgot his name. Is it? You remember Martin? Who is it? Yeah, Mackenzie. He showed they did an RCT, I think in Kenya too, right? Or in Ethiopia, in the Philippines, where they push aspirations too much. So people, and they were linking this with savings, right, as a form of investments in the future. And they actually showed that people which aspirations were pushed too far, they actually save less, which was not really good for people. So they are like, oh, wait, we need to be careful. So that basically call all researchers to, hey, if you're thinking about doing an RCT, trying to make aspirations, as an external variation on that, be careful because we don't know how that will actually impact people.
Thanks, great presentation. And I keep wondering, like in practical terms, how would you change farmers' attitude towards aspiration? Like, what would be a strategy or a mechanism to make them increase and be careful with what they say? And the other question is, like, both of your examples are with farmers that have long-term crops, you could say, like, it's a long-term investment, and same thing in the old-time example as well. But what happens with those with crops that are short-term, like rice or potatoes? Will this work? And you are showing a little bit that in that short term that usually doesn't hold. So I don't know how aspirations could influence the adoption of new technologies for these other farmers that are not with those long-term crops.
Yeah, well, the first part of the question, these guys from the World Bank, Mackenzie and his co-authors, what they do normally is a training session where they set up people, give them workshops on the impact of savings, what is important. They specifically set goals for those people. So basically they train them and say, okay, you earn this amount of money now. So how much do you want to earn in the future? What are the things that you need to do in this case to earn more, right? So they kind of try to set goals, specific goals for them. And then they follow them through time so they can try to achieve those goals. So that's the way that they try to notch aspirations, which is actually work. When at the very end of this is a study, they measured against aspirations of people was skyrocketing, but at the end of the day, it had a bad impact because, put it in this way, it's really easy to see it. When you have your aspiration or what you decide is really close to what you're doing, you're like, I'm already there, I'm not gonna effort too much. But if your desire or whatever goal you have, it's too far, you're also like, I'm never going to achieve that. I'm earning, let's say, $1,000 right now. I want to earn like $1 million. I'm not gonna do anything. It will be impossible for me to. So that's how basically aspirations work. Right? You need to nudge it like in the specific right direction, but not too much, so you get to the optimum, to the top of the U inverted. But nobody knows how to do that, and I think we won't have an answer for that. Exactly. This exactly. So it's gonna be really hard. And the other question was a really valid question. When we started examining this, the first thing that we wanted to explore was rice farmers. But again, when we started reviewing the literature, we found out that, okay, there's all these people, I mean, all these studies are mostly done on education, actually. That's like 90% of the studies on aspirations. And basically they show that the aspiration of their parents influence how much they invest on their children's education, which they don't reap benefits until 10, 12, 15 years, right? So that was one of our limitations why we didn't do it with rice farmers. So that's why we decided to do it with cacao farmers. And then we somehow tried to come up with the, the proxy for short-term investment, which is fertilizer. I mean, there's still a lot of research that can be done on this topic. This is fairly new, 7, 8 years ago. So, I mean, probably, I don't know, depends on the condition or the cultural context might change. I don't know yet. So there are a lot of more questions than answers at this point, I guess.
But sorry, you mentioning education actually. If you don't read the rewards until later, the rice or whatever maize farming,
you reap it immediately, right? Yeah. It might still be able, but for example, Bloem, a co-author, he has a paper on investments. It's not investments in agriculture, but investment on land tenure. So those are the type of things that you might want to live. Probably you can work with rice farmers, but probably study how much they invest on land tenure, on their land operations. Because at the very end, that will be the long-term investment, right? So it will be their proxy, will be, okay, so I harvest rice 2 or 3 times a year, so I'm gonna start investing in expanding my operations, probably buying more land. But I don't know, I mean, there is still a lot of research that needs to be done. This is a specific case of cacao farmers in the coastal zone of Ecuador, right? It might be the case that it holds for short terms in other crops. I don't know yet, but I guess more people are gonna start doing this because papers are just showing up.
Yeah, I have a methodological question. So do you use the Tanaka for your research?
Prospect theory, yeah.
So, but the Tanaka method, you use the same or similar one?
I use the one that I have in agricultural economics, where we tailor it for, the 2 type of seeds and.
Yeah, exactly. So now I'm wondering, so here, okay, maybe it's a yes or no. So in this method, I think your reference point is 0, right? And
Yeah.
then in your aspiration framework, your reference point is your
current level. Yeah.
So do you think you have to model it into the risk?
So we were having this discussion because the first thing that we thought about was running Holland Lorry. But then when you start reviewing the aspirations concept, you find, okay, this Jennifer and Ray got inspired by actually Tversky and Kahneman because the reference point and expected utility is not actually able to capture this reference point. So we were like, okay, we need to go for prospect theory because we need to mimic this reference point somehow. But what will be the right way to mimic this reference point? But
did you choose 0 or did you choose the individual income, the current income?
For the aspirations, it's the current income, it's the aspirations gap. For this one, for the risk experiments, it's the Tanaka 0.
Okay.
It's 0.
There's also like another paper by Dalton and like the people. So basically, like they show that like it's more internal constraints, that like the function is the initial aspiration level, which would be the reference point, and you can think about like hypothetical something maybe, and then
Yeah.
the outcome variable would be the outcome.
And now what people are also doing is, Martin already mentioned this, it's considered this concept of aspirations a multi-dimensional concept. Because right here, we're only doing income aspirations, but people are creating indexes for education aspirations, income aspirations, happiness aspirations. I don't know how that works, but people are becoming with crazy ideas to make this, more holistic somehow.
But I think it would be interesting to then personalize the Tanaka and say, okay, now we have your reference point. Okay, let's see what happens.
Yeah.
If you lose from 0, if you win from 0, do you think it would be worse looking at?
It will be worth looking at. It will take a lot of more time and money. Yeah.
I guess so too.
Yeah. You can actually tailor the Tanaka experiment with a reference point, and that will make.
Take the individual one.
And you can check, but then you have to run not individual sessions, but individual experiments with each of the farmers, which requires a lot of resources and effort. Yeah. All right, well, thank you very much. I think this is the end of the session, and we have more sessions, I think, coming after this.
Yeah.
When I was young, I was like, okay, I did that, I did that, I did that, I did that. Nah, it's really cool that, you know, seeing other people in other contexts doing the same. I'm gonna keep working on aspirations, and actually with Selena that was there, we're like doing some experiments in India, planning to work back again. But the problem with that is that, you know, when you do this in the field, you need a lot of support. So if you're able to find like an NGO or a company or something, that's what I yeah, exactly. At least as for me right now, I have some, you know, that actually almost every day I'm doing it. Worst is the next one.